Aria Bennett had exactly 4 minutes before her interview started, and she spent 3 of them shamelessly flirting with a stranger in an elevator. He was tall, composed, and almost unreasonably good-looking. She did not overthink it. She smiled, and then asked, point blank, if he was open to grabbing coffee sometime. He looked at her for a moment, said nothing, and then the doors opened. She walked out feeling bold, maybe even proud of herself. She had no idea she was about to sit across from him in an interview room. The conference room door was already open when Aria arrived. She stood at the threshold for exactly 1 second, long enough to see him, long enough for the floor to feel like it had shifted, and then she walked in anyway, because there was nothing else she could do. He was seated at the head of the table, jacket straightened, hands folded, expression completely unreadable. The same man from the elevator. The same man she had smiled at, like she had nothing to lose. He did not acknowledge her entrance with anything more than a glance, and somehow that was worse than if he had laughed outright. She took the only open chair and set her portfolio on the table. There were 2 other interviewers in the room, a woman from HR named Rachel, and a senior manager whose name Aria immediately forgot, but her attention kept pulling back to the man at the head of the table like gravity. A small nameplate sat in front of him. She made herself read it slowly, the way you read something you are hoping you misunderstood. Adrian Cole, chairman. She had asked the chairman of the company for his number in a moving elevator 4 minutes ago. Rachel opened the interview with the standard questions: background, strengths, what drew Aria to the company. Aria answered each one cleanly, precisely, the way she had practiced in her bathroom mirror for 3 days. She had spent weeks preparing for this. She knew their market share, their last 2 annual reports, the direction their expansion strategy was heading. She had not prepared, however, for the possibility of being recognized as the woman who had just propositioned the company's top executive before formally introducing herself. That particular scenario had not come up in any career advice she had ever read. Adrian Cole said very little for most of the interview. He asked 2 questions, both of them sharp and specific, one about her approach to problem-solving under pressure, one about a gap in her resume she had hoped would go unnoticed. His voice was calm and even, the kind of calm that did not feel relaxed so much as controlled. He did not look at her the way she expected. He did not smirk, did not raise an eyebrow, did not give any indication that he remembered her at all. And somehow, that made it harder, not easier, to get through the next 40 minutes without unraveling. She left the building with the certainty that she had not gotten the job. Not because her answers were bad, she knew they were not, but because no reasonable person in his position would hire someone who had done what she did. She replayed the elevator in her head twice on the train ride home, and then made herself stop, because replaying it a 3rd time was not going to change anything. She had walked in there and done the best she could with a situation that was already beyond saving, and that was all there was to say about it. 4 days later, she got the email. She read it twice before she let herself believe it. The subject line said, "Offer of employment, Bennett, Aria," and the body confirmed it in plain language. The position was hers if she accepted by the end of the week. She sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold and tried to figure out what it meant that Adrian Cole had apparently decided to hire her anyway. She did not have a satisfying answer. She accepted the offer by noon. The company was called Caldwell Group, and it occupied the top 8 floors of a glass tower in the financial district. It had the kind of polished, pressurized atmosphere that made even the break room feel like somewhere you needed to perform. Aria learned this on her first official morning, when a colleague named Marcus gave her a building orientation that was really just a thinly veiled introduction to the unspoken rules. Don't be loud in the corridors near the executive floor. Don't show up to a meeting without having already read the brief. And under no circumstances, Marcus said, with the tone of someone who had learned this the hard way, do you try to small-talk Adrian Cole. Aria nodded at each rule and said nothing about the elevator. She found her footing quickly in the work itself. She was good at her job, detail-oriented, fast, and genuinely interested in the problems she was hired to solve. And within her first week, she had already made herself useful in ways that went slightly beyond her official role. Her direct supervisor, a composed and methodical woman named Claire, noticed and said so, which helped. The work gave her something to hold on to, a reason to walk into the building each morning with her head straight, instead of watching the elevator doors like they were a threat. The problem was that Adrian Cole was not easy to avoid in a building where he effectively set the temperature of every room he entered. She did not encounter him daily. He moved in a different orbit. Executive meetings, board calls, decisions that happened behind closed doors, on floors she had no reason to visit. But the building had a way of collapsing distance without warning. She would be walking toward the copy room, and he would be coming from the opposite direction, and she would have approximately 3 seconds to decide whether to look at him or through him. She always chose through him. He never gave any indication that he noticed either way. That was its own particular kind of tension. It showed up in her work in small ways she hated. She was precise and composed by nature, the kind of person who thought through a problem completely before opening her mouth. But in any meeting where Adrian Cole was present, even tangentially, even when he was only half paying attention to the part of the agenda that involved her, she became slightly less precise. She answered a question she should have asked for clarification on first. She approved a timeline before double-checking the third dependency. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that anyone else would have flagged, but she noticed, and she kept an internal tally of every moment she had not been completely herself. The gossip about him arrived in pieces, the way office gossip usually did, offered casually between tasks by people who assumed everyone already knew most of it. Adrian Cole had been running Caldwell Group for 6 years. He had rebuilt 2 failing divisions and cut one that wasn't worth saving. He was, by every measurable standard, exceptional at his job, and he was also, by near universal account, someone who did not invite personal conversation. Not cold, exactly. More like precisely bounded. He was unfailingly professional, rarely harsh, and completely impossible to read. Nobody in the building claimed to know him well. Some people said he preferred it that way. Nobody argued with that. Aria filed all of it and kept her head down. She told herself the discomfort would fade. She had done nothing wrong, technically. She had not known who he was in the elevator. She had not behaved inappropriately in any formal sense, and she had performed well enough in the interview to earn the job on her own. The situation was uncomfortable, not compromising. She was a professional. He was her company's chairman. There was a clear and practical distance between them, and she intended to maintain it without drama or acknowledgement until the memory of that elevator ride eventually became too small and too old to matter anymore. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It made complete sense. She just had not accounted for the fact that Adrian Cole, apparently, had a different plan entirely. It happened on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into her employment, in the narrow corridor outside the executive conference room. Aria was carrying a folder, walking fast, already running 2 minutes behind a briefing she was supposed to attend. He came around the corner from the opposite direction, and they nearly collided, close enough that she caught the faint scent of his coffee before she registered his face. She stepped back immediately, said "excuse me" to the middle of his chest, and kept moving without looking up. It was efficient. It was sensible. It was also, she knew even as she did it, completely transparent. A person who had forgotten the elevator would have looked up. A person who had moved on would not have turned slightly toward the wall. She made it to the briefing on time and spent the first 10 minutes of it answering a question she had not fully heard because she was still reconstructing the last 45 seconds in her head. The avoidance became a minor project she managed alongside her actual work. She started taking the stairs when she knew the executive floor was active. She positioned herself at the far end of tables during joint meetings. Not noticeably far, just far enough. She answered every email from the office of the chairman promptly and professionally, addressed to whichever assistant had actually sent it, and she did not add anything unnecessary at the end. She was not hiding. She was simply maintaining a sensible professional perimeter, which was a completely different thing, and she was doing it without making it anyone else's problem. What she had not anticipated was that maintaining the perimeter would cost her anything. She had assumed the discomfort was directional, hers alone, running from her end of the building toward the executive floor and stopping neatly at the boundary. She had not considered that something might be running in the other direction. He stopped her on a Thursday afternoon in the small corridor that connected the main office floor to the east stairwell. It was not a place where important conversations happened. It was a place where people went to take a private phone call or avoid someone in the break room. Aria had been heading toward the stairwell specifically because she had seen him walking toward the elevators from across the open floor, and the stairwell was the more rational choice. He had apparently anticipated that. "Ms. Bennett," his voice was even, not loud. She stopped because there was a version of not stopping that did not look like what it was. She turned around and found him standing at a composed distance, hands in his pockets, watching her with the particular expression she had come to associate with him, unreadable at the surface, but not empty underneath. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. Adrian Cole looked at her for a moment, the way he seemed to look at most things, like he was taking his time with it and did not particularly care if that made anyone uncomfortable. Then he said, "You asked for my number in the elevator on the morning of your interview." It was not a question, and it was not said with any particular edge. It was simply a fact, placed in the air between them with the same calm efficiency he apparently applied to everything. Aria kept her expression neutral through what she estimated was a significant act of will. "I did," she said. "I didn't know who you were." "I know you didn't." He tilted his head slightly. "That was apparent. What I'm less clear on is why, since then, you've been behaving as though you'd like to disappear every time we're in the same room." Aria opened her mouth and then closed it again, because the honest answer, that she was embarrassed, that she had replayed the elevator more times than she was willing to admit, that she genuinely could not tell whether he found the whole thing amusing or professionally problematic, was not something she intended to hand to him in a hallway. She went with the version that was still true, just smaller. "I thought it would be easier," she said, "to keep a clear distance." Adrian regarded her steadily. "Easier for whom?" She did not have a clean answer to that, so she said nothing. He nodded once, as if her silence had confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he said, "I hired you because your interview was the strongest one I'd seen in 2 years. The elevator had nothing to do with it." He let that land, and then added, "But I'll be honest with you, Ms. Bennett. I found the elevator considerably more interesting than I expected to." He said it simply, without performance, like it was just another fact he was offering for her consideration. Then he walked back toward the main floor, and Aria stood in the corridor for a moment, with the distinct feeling that the perimeter she had been maintaining so carefully had just been quietly stepped over. It did not happen quickly. Nothing between them moved quickly, because neither of them was the kind of person who let things move fast without understanding where they were going. But it moved, steadily, almost cautiously, through a series of conversations that started because of work and extended past it, through lunches that began as functional and became something harder to categorize, through an afternoon when he asked her what she actually thought about a restructuring proposal and listened to her full answer without interrupting, and she realized that he genuinely wanted to know. He was different up close than he was from across a conference table. Not warmer, exactly. He was still precise, still measured, still capable of a kind of focused silence that made most people fidget. But there was a directness to him that she found she respected more than she had expected to, and a dry, spare humor that surfaced rarely and without announcement, which somehow made it land harder when it did. She started looking for it. That was probably the first sign she was in trouble. She also noticed, without intending to, the way people responded to him, not with warmth, but with a particular kind of deference that had been earned rather than assumed. He did not manage by pressure. He managed by being, consistently and without exception, the most prepared person in any room he entered. People worked harder around him, not because they feared him, but because lowering your standard in his presence felt genuinely embarrassing. Arya understood that feeling firsthand. She also understood by now that it was not the only feeling he produced in her, and that distinction was the part that needed to be handled carefully. They did not discuss what was happening between them in explicit terms, at least not at first. It existed in the space between professional and personal without a clean label, and for a while that felt manageable. They were careful. They didn't let it show at work. No preferential treatment. No visible change in how they addressed each other in meetings. No reason for anyone to look twice. Arya kept doing her job at the same quality she had always held herself to, and Adrian kept treating her with the same professional directness he showed everyone else. The private layer stayed private. That was the agreement. Unspoken, but understood. What she had not fully accounted for was how much energy it took to hold two versions of the same relationship in her head at once. The one that existed inside the building's official hours, and the one that existed outside them, or the way that energy would eventually find somewhere to go. It was a Tuesday evening in her 6th week. Most of the floor had cleared out by 7, and Arya was still at her desk working through a vendor analysis that Claire needed before the morning. She had not planned to stay late, but the work had a momentum to it, and she was almost finished, so she stayed. She was not aware that Adrian was still in the building until he appeared at the edge of the open floor, jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the elbows, carrying his laptop under one arm, with the look of a man who had also not planned to still be here. He saw her and came over without ceremony. He looked at her screen for a moment, said the third column's methodology was going to be questioned, and she should add a footnote, and then he sat up at the empty desk beside hers, because the network connection was better there. They worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that had stopped being uncomfortable some weeks ago. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, he ordered food without asking, which she would have found presumptuous from anyone else, and they ate at the desks without making a production of it. It was quiet. It was easy. It felt, more than almost anything in the previous 6 weeks, completely natural. That was when the elevator doors across the floor opened, and a junior analyst named Derek stepped out, clearly having forgotten something, and stopped when he saw them. Not just stopped, registered, calculated, and tried very quickly to arrange his face into something neutral before either of them looked up. He was not entirely successful. He collected what he came for and left without saying much. Arya watched the elevator doors close behind him and felt the ease of the last hour drain out of the room like something physical. She knew what Derek had seen. 2 takeout containers on adjacent desks at 9:15. On a Tuesday, the chairman of the company sitting close enough to comment on her screen, neither of them with any official reason to still be there. It was not incriminating. It was also not nothing. And Derek was not the kind of person who sat on information quietly, not out of malice, but because the office was his social ecosystem, and everything that happened in it was, to him, inherently shareable. By the following morning, the air on the floor felt different. Nothing explicit. No one said anything to her face, no formal complaint, no meeting request from HR. But she felt it in the way a conversation would shift when she approached, in the careful neutrality of Marcus's expression when he asked how late she'd stayed the night before, in the particular way Rachel from HR smiled at her in the hallway that managed to communicate knowledge without a single word. The information had moved, It had not become a story yet, but it was becoming one. Arya sat at her desk that afternoon and did the math she had been avoiding doing. She thought about what she had built at Caldwell Group in 6 weeks. The credibility, the professional trust, the reputation for being someone whose work spoke for itself, rather than someone who needed anything other than her output to justify her presence. She thought about how fragile all of that was, and how quickly a misread situation could undo it. And she thought about how she had worked too long and too hard for her first real job to become the woman people whispered about when she left a room. She also thought about Adrian Cole, about what he meant when he said he found the elevator interesting, about the way he listened to her like she was worth hearing, about how she had not felt that kind of easy, specific attention from another person in a long time. She thought about all of it, and then she made the decision that felt like the only responsible one available to her. She sent him a message that evening, brief and direct. She needed to pull back. What was developing between them was real enough that it deserved honesty, and honest enough that it deserved a pause. She was not willing to risk what she had built on something that had not yet proven it could hold weight. She asked him to respect that. He read it. He did not respond right away, and when he did, it was only 4 words. "I'll give you space." She told herself that was the right outcome. She sat with that for a long time. He gave her space. He was precise about it, the way he was precise about everything. No ambiguity, no lingering, no engineered reasons to cross the boundary she had drawn. At work, he treated her exactly as he always had in professional settings, directly, without favoritism, with the same measured attention he gave to anyone whose output he relied on. If it cost him anything to maintain that, he did not show it. She told herself that was fine. She told herself it was exactly what she had asked for, and that it was working, and that the particular flatness she felt walking into the building each morning was just the natural recalibration of someone who had made a sensible decision. She was not entirely convincing, even to herself. The rumors settled after about a week and a half. Nothing had been confirmed. Nothing had escalated to HR. And without new information to sustain it, the story lost its momentum and dissolved back into the general background noise of the office. Marcus stopped watching her with that careful neutrality. Rachel stopped smiling at her with that loaded professionalism. The floor returned to its normal temperature. By every external measure, Arya had managed the situation correctly. She had acted before it became something she could not manage, and the cost had been contained. That was the definition of a good call. She sat with the definition of a good call for 2 weeks and found it increasingly unsatisfying. The thing she kept returning to was not the connection itself. It was the conversation in the corridor, the one where he had stood at a composed distance and told her, without calculation or performance, that he found her interesting. Not the version of her that had walked into the interview with 2 years of preparation loaded and ready. The version that had smiled at a stranger in a moving elevator and asked for his number like it was the most natural thing in the world. He had seen both versions and made a point of naming the one she had been trying to walk back. That was not something she could fold away neatly and file. She was also, if she was being honest with herself, tired of performing a version of professionalism that required her to act like she had not noticed anything. She was good at her job. She was not, it turned out, good at pretending that a meaningful thing was not meaningful, and she was not sure that ability was something she actually wanted to develop. Adrian, for his part, had his own accounting to do. He had built something at Caldwell Group over 6 years that was not accidental. The reputation, the results, the particular atmosphere of high standards and clean boundaries, none of it had happened by default. It had been constructed deliberately, maintained consistently, and it had cost him things he had decided were worth the cost. He was not sentimental about that. He understood the terms. A chairman who kept his distance from personal entanglement in the workplace was a chairman who kept his authority intact, and authority intact was what Caldwell Group needed from him, and so that was the version of himself he had committed to. What he had not anticipated was Aria Bennett in an elevator, asking for his number with the confidence of someone who had no reason to be nervous and no idea she should be. There had been something in that, something unmanufactured and direct and genuinely surprising, that had gotten under the careful architecture he maintained and refused to be filed. He had hired her because her interview was the strongest one in 2 years, and that was true. It was also true that he had been curious, in a way he did not often allow himself to be, about the person who could walk into an interview room minutes after doing what she had done and still answer every question like she owned the room. He had told himself, in the weeks that followed, that the appropriate response was observation. Watch how she worked, confirm that the hire had been as good as it looked on paper, and keep the rest at a distance that did not compromise anyone. He had managed that, more or less, until the night with the takeout containers and the empty floor, when the distance had collapsed so naturally that he had not noticed it going. And then she had sent the message, and he had respected it, because she had asked him to, and because she wasn't wrong that the situation needed handling. But he had also spent the following 2 weeks aware, in a way he could not entirely suppress, that something real had been put on hold. He was not accustomed to putting things he had actually decided on hold. He was accustomed to knowing what he wanted, determining whether it was feasible, and proceeding accordingly. The variables in this situation were harder to sequence than usual, which told him something about the weight of them. She ran into him in the lobby on a Friday evening, coming in opposite directions through the revolving door. This time, neither of them had anywhere immediately to be, and neither of them pretended otherwise. They stood in the lobby for a moment, with the Friday evening current of the building moving around them, and then Adrian said, "Do you have 10 minutes?" And Aria said, "Yes." They took the east stairwell, her old avoidance route, which was not lost on either of them, and sat on the landing between 2 floors, which was absurd, and also completely removed from anywhere that anyone relevant would think to look on a Friday at 6 in the evening. Adrian sat with his back against the wall and his forearms on his knees, looking like a man who had made his peace with sitting in a stairwell, if that was what the situation required. Aria sat across from him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I actually wanted when I sent that message." Adrian looked at her steadily. "And?" "I wanted to protect the job," she said. "That was real. I worked hard for this position, and I wasn't willing to let it become something people used to define me before I'd had the chance to define it myself." She kept her voice even, not defensive. "But I also think I used the job as cover for something else. It was easier to say I was protecting my career than to admit that I didn't know what to do with what was happening between us, and walking away felt like the version of the situation I could control." He listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about him she had cataloged early and never stopped noticing. "So I'm not taking it back," she said, "the decision I made. But I wanted to be honest with you about why I made it, because you were honest with me in that corridor, and I didn't give you the same thing in return." Adrian was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was at the same register as always, measured without effect. But there was something behind it that she had learned to read by now. "I've spent a long time," he said, "being exactly the version of myself that Caldwell Group needs. Not performing it. I mean, that's genuinely who I am in that building, and I'm not interested in apologizing for it. But there's a difference between being that person and deciding that's the only person available." He looked down at his hands briefly, then back at her. "You made me aware of that difference. I wasn't particularly looking for it." Aria said, "That sounds almost like a complaint." "It isn't." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, the dry and minimal version of a smile that she had learned to watch for. "It's an acknowledgement." She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want to be a secret. I'm not willing to build something that requires us to act like it isn't happening every time we're inside that building. I've watched enough situations like that to know that they don't hold. And when they break, the person with less power is always the one who absorbs most of the damage. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to be a secret. He said it without qualification. What I'm asking, what I think is worth asking, is whether you're willing to figure out what the boundaries actually need to look like, rather than deciding the only safe option is no option. She looked at him. He looked back. This was, she thought, the most honest conversation she had had in a professional context in her life, and they were having it on a stairwell landing at 6 o'clock on a Friday, which was either completely ridiculous or exactly right, and she found she did not particularly care which. I'm willing to figure it out, she said. What followed was not a dramatic resolution. There was no single moment where everything snapped cleanly into place, because that was not how either of them operated, and the situation was not one that rewarded clean snapping. What there was instead was a deliberate and ongoing construction of clarity, of limits, of an understanding about what each context required from both of them. At work, nothing changed publicly. Arya kept doing her job at the same standard she had always held herself to, and Adrian kept treating her with the same professional directness he showed everyone. The line between professional and personal was not blurred. It was, if anything, more clearly defined than before, because they had actually talked about it explicitly, instead of relying on unspoken assumptions to hold it in place. They both understood where the work ended and the rest of it began, and they held that distinction with the same consistency they applied to everything else. Outside the building, they stopped managing the distance. They had dinner on a Saturday, without any particular significance attached to the location or the hour. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Caldwell Group, and Arya discovered that Adrian Cole off-duty was not a fundamentally different person from Adrian Cole in a board meeting. Still precise, still measured, still capable of a silence that contained more than most people's full sentences, but that the precision was turned on different things, and that was a meaningful difference. She found she liked the person on both sides of the building's revolving door. That was not a small thing. The whispers in the office never fully disappeared. They rarely do, in buildings where people spend more waking hours together than they do anywhere else. But they shifted in character. Less speculation, more acknowledgement. The people who worked closely with Arya watched her work and found nothing to fault. The people who worked closely with Adrian found no change in his standards or his decisions. There was no favoritism to point to, no breach of the professional conduct that Caldwell Group ran on. And slowly, without announcement, the story stopped being interesting enough to sustain attention, because there was nothing in either of them that fed it. Arya sat at her desk one morning about a month later. Same desk, same view, same folder of vendor analyses she had started in her first week, and noticed that she had walked into the building that morning without once thinking about the elevator. Not because she had forgotten it. It was still there, the whole sequence of it. The smile, the number she had asked for from a stranger who turned out to be her chairman, the 4 minutes that had started everything. She had not forgotten any of it. She had just stopped needing to manage it, and that, she realized, was the thing she had actually been working toward all along. Not the absence of fear, not the elimination of risk, just the point where she had handled it well enough that it no longer needed to be handled, and what remained was simply what she had chosen. With open eyes, with full awareness of the costs, and with enough self-respect to have asked for what she actually needed rather than what was easiest. That was not a small thing either. The elevator doors opened at her floor. She stepped in without looking up, the way she always had. And this time, there was no one else inside.